The kitchen smelled of expensive perfume and cruelty. "You can't even hold a fork properly," she said, her voice dripping with a contempt so practiced it had become effortless. "Look at you. What kind of man can't even feed himself?" He said nothing. His hands trembled, not from weakness, not entirely, but from the particular exhaustion that comes from being wounded by the same person, in the same way, every single day until the wound stops bleeding and simply becomes part of who you are. "Delia," the maid whispered from the corner of the kitchen, her eyes dropping to the marble floor tiles. "Shall I help Mr. Callum with his?" "Did I ask you to speak, Rosa?" Delia turned slowly, the way a woman turns when she has never once doubted that the room belongs to her. Her silk robe, champagne-colored and monogrammed, swept the floor like a queen's train. "He's a grown man, or he used to be." She laughed then, a small, musical, devastating laugh. "And Callum Monroe, the man in the wheelchair, the man with the broad shoulders that still carried the ghost of who he once was, the man with deep-set gray eyes that had once looked at this woman with something close to worship, said nothing. He simply looked out the window. And the silence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. What she did next broke him more. "Please sit back. Relax as we dive fully into this really remarkable story. There is a particular kind of man who builds his life the way an architect builds a cathedral, with intention, with precision, with the quiet confidence that what he is constructing will outlast him. Callum Monroe was that kind of man. At 41, he had been the kind of person that other people noticed when he walked into a room, not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned everything he had and forgotten none of the cost. He stood 6'2" in his prime. Dark hair peppered with early gray at the temples, the kind that made him look distinguished rather than aged. His hands had been steady and sure, hands that had once designed the Monroe business complex on the east side of the city, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that still bore his name on the lobby wall in brushed gold letters 3 inches tall. He had built Monroe architecture and development from a single drafting table in a 2-room apartment into a firm with 47 employees and contracts across 4 states. He had done it before 40. He had done it with discipline, with sacrifice, with 10-hour days and a love of structure so deep it was almost philosophical. He believed, truly believed, that if you built something well, if the foundation was honest and the walls were strong, it would hold. He applied this belief to his marriage. This was, perhaps, his greatest miscalculation. He had met Delia Hartwell at a charity gala 6 years before the accident, she in a shimmering sapphire gown that made her look like something the ocean had gifted to the shore. She was 32 then, with the kind of beauty that required no apology and offered none. Dark auburn hair that fell in controlled waves past her collarbone. Green eyes with flecks of amber that caught the light in a way that felt almost deliberate. A laugh that arrived like a surprise and lingered like a question. She had told him she was a consultant, interior design, corporate branding, that sort of thing. She spoke in the confident shorthand of someone who expected to be believed without elaboration. Callum had believed her. He believed her the way a man believes the sky before a storm, completely, because there is no visible reason not to. They married 18 months after the gala. The wedding was held at the Whitmore estate, 92 guests, string quartet, white peonies arranged in architectural clusters, because Callum had insisted on a certain geometric symmetry even in flowers, and Delia had laughed and called him impossibly charming and kissed him in front of everyone with a warmth that felt like the truest thing in the room. He had cried just slightly at the altar. He was not ashamed of it. He thought he had finally built the most important thing. The crash happened on a Tuesday in November, 31 months into the marriage. Callum had been driving back from a site visit 3 hours outside the city, a new development contract that would have been the largest in his firm's history. He remembered the radio playing something classical, something with cellos, and the rain beginning against the windshield with that particular rhythm that makes a person feel enclosed and safe. He did not remember the truck. He woke up 4 days later in a hospital bed with the particular confusion of a man who does not yet understand the geometry of what has changed. The ceiling tiles, the sound of monitors, The smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, something he couldn't name, which was, though he didn't know it yet, the smell of a life rearranging itself without his permission. The doctors spoke with measured precision. Spinal injury. Thoracic level. Incomplete, which meant sensation remained in parts of his body that complete injuries erased entirely. Which meant, the neurologist told him gently, that there was potential, but there was also a new reality to reckon with. He would not walk. Not without significant intervention. Not for a long time, perhaps never in the way he had before. His lower body had become a landscape he could feel in pieces but no longer command with confidence. A wheelchair, at least for the foreseeable future. Physical therapy. Patience. Patience, the doctor said, as though it were a prescription. Callum had nodded. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes were dry. He was the kind of man who processed devastation the way old buildings absorb an earthquake. Quietly, structurally, with the damage hidden in the walls, Delia had been at the hospital. Of course she had. She had arrived the second day in a cream-colored coat and with red-rimmed eyes, and she had held his hand and said, "We'll get through this, Cal, I swear we will." And he had believed her. He believed her the way he believed the sky. He did not yet see the storm. It took 4 months. 4 months of coming home to a house that no longer fit his body the same way. 4 months of ramps installed and doorways widened, and the particular indignity of needing assistance with things his body had once done with magnificent, thoughtless ease. 4 months of watching Delia's language shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the way paint fades rather than peels. "Be careful, Callum, you'll spill it again. I had to reschedule dinner because of you, you know. Can't keep doing everything while you just sit there." The words arrived like small cuts. Individually, each one might have been rationalized. Stress, frustration, the weight of a changed life pressing on them both. But they accumulated. They compounded. They built a structure of their own, not the kind Callum built, not strong and honest, but something crooked and load-bearing, something designed not to shelter but to diminish. He told himself she was overwhelmed. He told himself she was still adjusting. He told himself the woman in the sapphire gown was still somewhere inside the woman who now stood at the kitchen island every morning with her coffee and her disdain, looking at him with eyes that no longer held amber warmth but something colder, something assessing, the way a person looks at an asset that has lost its value. He was wrong. There had never been a woman in a sapphire gown. There had only ever been a performance. And the performance had required an audience of a certain kind, a successful man, a building with his name on it, a social position that benefited from proximity to his. When the man in the wheelchair replaced the man who walked into rooms and changed them, Delia Hartwell Monroe had made a quiet, private calculation. She had decided to stay. But she had decided, with equal quietness and equal coldness, to make him pay for the inconvenience. Rosa Mendez had worked in the Monroe household for 14 months. She was 44 years old, small-framed, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a manner so deliberately quiet that people tended to forget she was in the room. Which was, she had learned over 20 years of domestic work, sometimes a mercy and sometimes a curse. She had taken the position because the pay was fair and the house was beautiful, and because her youngest son was in his second year of college, and the numbers required her to work somewhere that paid fairly and on time. She had not expected to become a witness. But that is what she had become. Day by day, room by room, Rosa Mendez had accumulated an archive of moments that she carried in her chest like stones. Too heavy to ignore, too dangerous, she thought, to speak about without understanding fully what she was standing in the middle of. She had seen Delia snatch a glass from Callum's hand and pour the contents down the sink because she claimed it was making the countertop look cluttered. She had seen her accidentally park her car directly behind the accessibility ramp for a full afternoon, leaving Callum unable to go outside, then claim she had simply forgotten. She had heard the tone, that particular refined surgical tone, that Delia used exclusively with Callum when she was certain no outside ears were present. It was not the tone of a frustrated wife. Rosa had heard frustration. Frustration was human and messy and apologized for itself. This was not that. This was precise. This was practiced. This was a woman who had identified exactly which words and which silences could produce the maximum erosion in a specific human being. and had committed to applying them with the consistency of a professional. Rosa had seen Delia take phone calls in the garden with a laughter so free and bright, and entirely unlike the voice she used inside the house, that it had genuinely startled her the first time. She had noticed the distance Delia maintained in social settings, never cruel in public, never visibly cold, performing the role of devoted wife with a fluency that made Rosa feel briefly as though she had imagined everything she had seen. She had not imagined it. She knew she had not imagined it because of what happened on the morning of the 17th of March, a gray-skied Wednesday that smelled of rain and something ending, when Delia Monroe did something in the kitchen of her own home that removed any remaining possibility of doubt. It began, as so many cruelties do, with something small. Callum had been trying to make his own breakfast. This was part of his therapy, occupational independence, his physical therapist called it, the deliberate practice of reclaiming agency over the small tasks of one's own day. It was difficult. His grip had improved, but coordination remained a negotiation, and on that particular morning, a glass of orange juice had slipped. It did not shatter. It rolled and spilled in a widening amber pool across the white marble. Rosa had already moved toward the cabinet for a cloth. Don't. Delia's voice came from the doorway. One word, and it stopped the room like a switch. She walked in slowly. She was dressed, fully and impeccably, in a fitted charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her auburn hair pinned with the kind of studied casualness that requires a mirror and 20 minutes. She looked at the spilled juice. She looked at Callum. And then she laughed, not the surprised, brief, salvageable kind of laugh that could be written off as a nervous reflex. A long, measured, contemptuous laugh, the kind that was designed to land, designed to be heard, designed to reach something and reduce it. 41 years old, she said, moving to lean against the counter, arms crossed, green eyes moving over him with the slow deliberateness of an inspection. 41 years old and you can't manage a glass of orange juice. Tell me, Callum, what exactly do you contribute to this household? What is your function at this point? The kitchen was completely still. Rosa stood with the cloth in her hand and felt something move through her that was beyond discomfort. It was the particular vertigo of watching something wrong happen in real time and understanding that your presence is known, your witness is known, and the person committing the cruelty does not care. That last part was the most chilling thing. Delia knew Rosa was there. She had looked directly at her before she started speaking. And she had continued anyway, because the presence of a witness did not register as a reason to stop. It registered, Rosa understood with horrible clarity as an audience. Callum's gray eyes did not find the floor. He did not flinch. He looked at his wife with an expression that had moved entirely beyond pain into something quieter, and in its own way more devastating, the expression of a man who has stopped expecting anything different and has begun, somewhere deep and private, to do a different kind of accounting. You were supposed to be someone, Delia continued, softer now, which was somehow worse than the volume. I married someone, not this. She gestured with one elegant hand at the wheelchair, at the spilled juice, at the general architecture of everything he could no longer do. And then she picked up her coffee, turned, and walked out of the kitchen. Rosa stood in the silence she left behind. Callum looked out the window again. The sky outside was the same gray it had been all morning, but something had shifted. Rosa could feel it, though she couldn't name it yet, something in the quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of defeat. Not the stillness of a man who had given up, the stillness of a man who had made a decision. The storm had already begun, she realized, and it was silent. There is a particular kind of strength that only reveals itself in darkness. Not the loud, declarative strength of a man who has never been tested, but the subterranean kind. The kind that forms the way diamonds form, under unbearable pressure, in complete silence over time. The kind that nobody sees coming because it did not announce itself. It simply arrived, one quiet decision at a time, until the accumulation became undeniable. This was the strength that Callum Monroe had been building in the weeks following that Wednesday morning in the kitchen. Nobody in his house knew. That was entirely the point. After the orange juice morning, something had reorganized itself inside Callum, not dramatically, not with the kind of sharp internal declaration that makes for a clean story. It was quieter than that, more architectural. Like a man who has identified a fundamental flaw in a structure he built and has begun, methodically and without fanfare, to redesign it from the foundation. He said nothing different to Delia. He did not confront her. He did not withdraw in a way she would notice. He continued to occupy the role she had assigned him, the diminished man in the wheelchair, the inconvenience with a name on a building, because he understood something that his years in architecture had taught him more clearly than anything else. You never reveal the new blueprint before the old structure has been properly dismantled. What Delia did not know, what she had stopped bothering to know, having long since categorized him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood, was that Callum had spent the 6 weeks following that morning in a series of phone calls, video meetings, and carefully encrypted email exchanges that would have rearranged her understanding of their situation entirely. The first call had been to his attorney, not the firm that handled the Monroe household's general legal matters. Delia had a relationship with that firm's senior partner, a man named Gerald Fitch who played golf with her brother and whose loyalty, Callum had quietly concluded, was ambient rather than absolute. No. This call had been to a woman named Petra Holloway, a corporate and matrimonial attorney whose reputation was built on a specific kind of precision that other lawyers described, with a mixture of admiration and unease, as surgical. The second call had been to Marcus Webb, his oldest friend and the CFO who had helped him build Monroe architecture and development from the ground up. Marcus, who had watched Callum's marriage with the particular pained silence of a man who sees something going wrong and respects his friend enough not to say so until he is asked. Callum had asked. Marcus had answered with 27 years of loyalty and zero hesitation. The third call, the one that mattered most, the one that Delia would eventually understand had been the pivot point of everything, had been to the board of Monroe Architecture and Development. A call that Delia believed had not happened because she had, 7 months earlier, casually and with practiced subtlety, begun steering Callum toward the belief that his firm could operate without him at the helm while he focused on recovery, and that perhaps, given his condition, a more formal stepping back might be better for everyone, Cal, including you. What she did not know, because she had not asked and he had not told her, was that Callum had restructured his ownership position 3 months before that conversation ever happened. Quietly, legally, with Petra Holloway's guidance and Marcus Webb's execution. The kind of restructuring that moved certain assets into arrangements that were both entirely lawful and entirely invisible to a spouse who had stopped paying attention to anything beyond the surface. Delia believed she understood the financial landscape of their marriage. She understood approximately 40% of it. The rest had been rearranging itself in the quiet. Rosa Mendez was not, by nature or by habit, a woman who involved herself in the private catastrophes of the households where she worked. She had learned early in the first house, 22 years ago, when she was young enough to still believe that witnessing wrongdoing obligated her to speak about it, that speaking about it in the wrong direction, to the wrong person, at the wrong moment, could dismantle the life she was trying to protect. She had a son in college. She had a mother whose medication was not free. She had a practical understanding of vulnerability that did not permit her the luxury of impulsive righteousness. But Rosa also had, underneath the quietness and the pragmatism and the deliberately lowered eyes, a moral architecture as solid as anything Callum Monroe had ever drawn on paper. And that architecture had been under structural stress since the morning of the orange juice. She had replayed it. Repeatedly, involuntarily, the way a person replays a moment that refuses to file itself away into the manageable past. The sound of Delia's laughter, the way it had been aimed, the deliberateness of it. The way a person aims a weapon is different from the way they use a tool, and Rosa had grown old enough and watchful enough to know the difference. She had also, in the 5 weeks since that morning, noticed things she had perhaps been explaining away before. The medication, Callum's pain medication, prescribed and managed carefully by his physician, that seemed to be present on some days and inexplicably difficult to locate on others. The wheelchair's charging cable that Rosa had found, on 2 separate occasions, unplugged and pushed behind a piece of furniture in a manner that struck her as deliberate. Small things. The kind of things that could, individually, be attributed to household disorder or genuine forgetfulness, individually. Rosa had begun writing them down. In a small notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her work bag, dates, times, specific observations, word for word when she could manage it. She did not know, when she started, exactly what she was building. She knew only that her conscience required her to build something, and that whatever it was needed to be solid before it could be useful. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 23 days after the orange juice morning, that Rosa found herself alone in the study with Callum for the first time in a way that felt like a door opening rather than a coincidence. Delia had gone to what she called a wellness appointment. 3 hours, always on Thursdays, always with a particular vagueness about location that Rosa had long since stopped believing was accidental. The house had settled into the particular quality of quiet that only arrived in Delia's absence, a kind of atmospheric exhale, as though the rooms themselves were less tense. Callum was at his desk, the large, custom-built drafting table that had been adapted with extensions to accommodate his wheelchair. Working on something that Rosa could see, from the doorway, was not the passive occupation of a man in recovery. His hands moved across the drafting paper with a focus and a fluency that she had not seen in the common areas of the house. He looked like himself, she thought. He looked like the man whose photograph was on the company website, except different because the photograph showed a man standing, and this was a man seated, but the expression was the same. The concentration, the aliveness. She knocked softly on the door frame. He looked up. The focus didn't leave his eyes immediately. It receded slowly like a tide, making room for the present. Rosa. His voice was measured, warm in its baseline even when he was contained. "Do you need something?" She stood in the doorway for a moment that she would later describe as the longest of her professional life, and then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice lower than usual, steadier than she expected it to be, "I need to show you something. And I need you to understand that I am showing it to you because I believe it is the right thing to do, not for any other reason." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he rarely looked at anything in that house except the window, and said quietly, "Sit down, Rosa." She sat. She placed the notebook on the desk between them. She watched his gray eyes move across the first page. Then the second. Then the third. His jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt her. He did not ask her to stop. He read it the way he would read a structural report, thoroughly, without rushing, with the full attention of a man who understands that the information in front of him is load-bearing. When he reached the last entry, he closed the notebook. The silence in the room was long and specific. "Long have you been keeping this?" he asked. 23 days, Rosa said. "Since the morning in the kitchen." He nodded slowly. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Not surprise, she realized. Not surprise. Something more like the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been told, for the first time, that someone else can see it too. "Cable," he said quietly, as though to himself. "I thought I was losing my mind." "You were not losing your mind, Mr. Monroe." He looked at her. His gray eyes were steady and dry and held something in them that she found, unexpectedly, difficult to look at directly, not because it was weak, but because it was the opposite. It was the kind of composure that is so hard-won it becomes almost sacred. "Thank you," he said, just that. But the weight he put into it was the weight of a man who means far more than the words he's chosen and trusts the other person to understand the difference. Rosa nodded. She rose. She moved toward the door. "Rosa." His voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned. "I would like you to keep the notebook," he said, "and I would like you to continue adding to it." "Can you do that?" She looked at him for a moment, thought of her son, thought of her mother, thought of the morning in the kitchen and Delia's laugh, aimed like something thrown. She said, "I can do that." She left the study. In the hallway, she let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 23 days. Delia Monroe moved through the social world of their city with the particular ease of a woman who has curated her image the way a museum curates a collection, carefully, strategically, with a precise understanding of what is displayed and what remains in the archive. In public, she was devoted, attentive. She would touch Callum's shoulder at gatherings and say things like, "He's been so remarkable through all of this, and I honestly don't know how he keeps his spirit up. He amazes me." And people would nod and look at Callum with the particular mixture of pity and admiration that she had calibrated the narrative to produce. Callum bore these performances with the same stillness he brought to the kitchen window. But 4 weeks after Rosa and the notebook, something happened at a dinner, a fundraiser for the Monroe Architecture Foundation, an annual event that bore his name and had been organized, this year, primarily by his firm's managing director in Callum's reduced operational capacity. That cracked the performance in a way Delia had not anticipated and could not fully repair. The venue was the Ardmore, a restored ballroom space in the city's historic district that Callum's firm had actually consulted on 3 years prior. Round tables draped in ivory linen, chandeliers throwing amber light, the particular hum of a room full of people who knew each other well enough to perform comfort without feeling it. Delia had dressed for it with her usual precision, a deep emerald gown, structured at the shoulder, with her auburn hair swept into an architecture of its own. She looked like a woman who belonged at the center of every room she entered. This was intentional. This had always been intentional. She had spent the first 40 minutes working the room in the way she worked rooms, moving from cluster to cluster with her warm laugh and her calculated interest, mentioning Callum frequently enough to maintain the devoted wife performance, but returning to him infrequently enough that the evening's shape remained hers. What she had not accounted for was Vivienne Holt. Vivienne Holt was 71 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain of amber beads, and had known Callum Monroe since he was 26 years old, and drafting his first independent project on a table in her late husband's architectural firm. She was the kind of woman who did not perform warmth because she had never needed to. It was simply her default state, uncurated and therefore unmistakable. She found Callum near the window, of course, near the window, and sat beside him in the empty chair with the ease of someone who has never once needed to ask permission to be somewhere. "You look like you're holding the ceiling up with your mind," she said by way of greeting. Callum had smiled, a real smile, the kind Rosa had not seen in the main rooms of the house, the kind that rearranged his entire face. "Vivienne! Don't Vivienne me in that relieved tone, I'll get a complex." She patted his hand. "How are you, truthfully?" "Working on it," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in a social setting in months. Vivienne had looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had 71 years of context behind them. "You know," she said quietly, "Arnold used to say that the most important structure a man ever builds is the one he builds after the first one collapses." She tilted her head slightly. "I think you're in the middle of building something, Callum. I can see it." He had looked at her. Something moved across his face that he did not hide in time, something raw and certain and quietly enormous. "I am," he said. It was at precisely this moment that Delia appeared. She materialized at Callum's side with the smoothness of long practice, her hand dropping to his shoulder in the proprietary way she had mastered, not affectionate exactly, but performed so fluently that the distinction was invisible to most observers. "Vivienne," she said, warm smile deployed with zero loading time. "What a lovely dress." Vivienne looked at Delia's hand on Callum's shoulder. Then she looked at Delia's face. Then she smiled, the specific smile of a woman who has lived long enough to read rooms at frequencies younger people cannot access. "Delia," she said pleasantly, "you must be so proud of what Callum's firm has built." "Of course," Delia said, and there was something in the microsecond before the of course, something almost imperceptible, that Vivienne caught and Rosa, who had arrived to help with accessibility logistics and stood 15 feet away near the side entrance, also caught, a flicker. The barest contraction of something behind the green eyes, not pride, not warmth, calculation. How does this serve me? What is the correct response? Execute. "He really is extraordinary," Delia continued, her hand still on his shoulder, and the words landed with all their correctness and none of their meaning. Callum said nothing. He was looking at the window again. And Rosa, standing 15 feet away with her hands folded, and her notebook in her bag and 23 days of evidence, plus 4 additional weeks of continued documentation, watched the 3 of them, Vivienne with her amber beads and her ancient, accurate eyes, Delia with her emerald gown and her performance, Callum with his gray eyes and his silence and the enormous invisible structure he was building in the quiet, and understood that something was very close now, not the ending, not yet. But the moment before the ending, the held breath before the collapse, that particular charged stillness that every structure reaches just before the force applied to it exceeds what it was designed to hold. The storm had been silent for long enough. It was almost time to speak. There is a moment in every carefully constructed deception when the weight of what has been hidden becomes greater than the structure built to conceal it. Not a dramatic moment, not always loud. Sometimes it arrives as quietly as a phone left on a counter. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a document. Sometimes it arrives because someone who has been watching from a corner of the room for long enough finally decides that silence is no longer a neutral position. For Delia Monroe, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 weeks after the fundraiser at the Ardmore. She did not recognize it when it came. That was entirely her undoing. The phone call came at 9:47 in the morning. Delia was in the bedroom, her bedroom, the master suite she had quietly reclaimed as exclusively hers 8 months into Callum's recovery, under the reasonable-sounding premise that he needed a ground-floor room for accessibility, applying the second layer of a skincare routine that cost more per month than Rosa's weekly salary. She answered without checking the number, which was unusual. She was not a woman who answered calls from numbers she didn't recognize, but she had been expecting a call from her friend Margox about an upcoming trip, and she was distracted by her own reflection, and the phone was already in her hand. Delia Monroe? The voice was female, professionally neutral, with the particular cadence of someone who has delivered significant information many times and learned to deliver it without inflection. Yes, a small alertness entered her voice. Not alarm, not yet. This is Sandra Peel from the offices of Holloway Legal Associates. I'm calling to advise you that formal documentation has been filed with the court as of this morning. Our client, Mr. Callum Monroe, has initiated divorce proceedings. You should expect to receive physical copies at your registered address within the next 24 hours. Ms. Holloway wanted to ensure you received advance notification as a professional courtesy. The skincare brush stopped moving. In the mirror, Delia's green eyes went very still. I'm sorry, she said, and her voice had the quality of a person buying 3 seconds to reorganize. Could you repeat that? Sandra Peel repeated it, word for word, with the same professional neutrality, which was somehow worse than any emotional register would have been. When the call ended, Delia sat on the edge of the bed, the carefully made bed with its expensive linen and its decorative arrangement of pillows, and held the phone in her lap and looked at the middle distance for approximately 90 seconds. Then something moved across her face that was not grief and was not shock, but was something colder and more practical than either. The expression of a woman running rapid calculations, assessing damage, identifying angles. She reached for her phone again. She called Gerald Fitch. She did not know that Gerald Fitch had, 3 weeks prior, received a very quiet and very cordial communication from Petra Holloway's office that had contained enough forensically documented information about certain aspects of the Monroe household's recent history, cross-referenced with Rosa Mendez's notebook, which had by then been formally witnessed and submitted, to make Gerald Fitch understand, with the clarity that only genuine legal exposure produces, that his peripheral loyalty to Delia Monroe was a liability he could not professionally afford. Gerald Fitch did not answer her call. She stared at the phone. For the first time in a very long time, Delia Monroe had the experience of a door not opening when she reached for it. She did not know that every door she was about to reach for had been quietly, legally, and with considerable architectural precision, already addressed. Petra Holloway was 53 years old and conducted meetings the way Callum Monroe conducted structural assessments, with complete attention, zero redundancy, and a respect for the load-bearing elements that made lesser practitioners nervous. She met with Callum and Marcus Webb in a conference room on the 14th floor of her firm's building on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the filing. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A city laid out below them in the particular way that cities look from height, ordered and legible in a way they never are from street level. Callum sat at the head of the conference table. Gray suit, well-fitted. His posture in the wheelchair was the posture of a man who had stopped apologizing for the chair and had begun, instead, to inhabit it with the same authority he had once brought to standing in a room and expecting it to respond. "Walk me through where we are," he said, Petra opened the file with the efficiency of someone who has already walked through it 40 times and knows exactly which elements require emphasis. Asset restructuring you completed prior to the divorce filing is legally sound, she said. The Monroe architecture and development ownership position, the intellectual property portfolio, and the holdings we moved into the Monroe Family Trust are protected. Delia's legal team, and she will retain legal representation, so prepare for that, will attempt to argue that the restructuring was premeditated in anticipation of divorce and therefore constitutes dissipation of marital assets. That argument will not succeed because the restructuring predates any documented marital breakdown by a margin that removes the causation argument. Marcus Webb, silver-haired and steady across the table, leaned forward slightly. And the property. The Whitmore Lane house is marital property. She will receive her share of its value. That's unavoidable and appropriate. Petra's voice carried no editorializing. What she will not receive is the firm, the trust, or the intellectual portfolio. Which means what she walks away with is significantly less than what she has spent the last 2 years behaving as though she had already secured. Callum looked at the city below the window. And Rosa's documentation, he asked. Petra placed a hand on a separate, slimmer folder. Rosa Mendez's testimony, combined with the dated notebook entries and 2 additional items we identified through the discovery process, the medication irregularities and the accessibility equipment interference, have been formally submitted. We are not pursuing criminal charges at this stage. However, the documentation is part of the record, which means it is available to the court and to the public record should any further proceedings become relevant. She paused. It also means that Delia Monroe's legal team is aware that we have it, which changes their negotiating position considerably. She didn't think anyone was watching, Marcus said quietly, with the particular tone of a man who is trying and failing to keep the anger entirely out of his voice. No, Callum said. He was still looking at the city. She didn't think anyone mattered enough to watch. Room was quiet for a moment. There's one more thing, Petra said. Callum looked at her. Wellness appointments. She opened to a specific page. Thursdays, 3 hours, the location she was consistently vague about. She set a document on the table and slid it toward him without comment. He read it. His jaw tightened. His gray eyes moved across the page with the same controlled thoroughness he brought to everything. And when he finished, he set it face down on the table. He did not ask any questions about it. He simply nodded. Proceed, he said. And that was that. Delia retained a lawyer named Harrison Cole, whose reputation was built on aggressive negotiating tactics and a client list that included 3 previous high-asset divorces in the city's upper social tier. He was known for finding leverage and applying it without ceremony. He called Petra Holloway's office within 48 hours of the filing. The conversation, by all accounts, lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, Harrison Cole sat quietly in his own conference room for a time that his paralegal later described as unusual for him, and then made a phone call to Delia that she did not enjoy receiving. Because what Harrison Cole had discovered in 11 minutes, what Petra Holloway had laid out for him with the particular calm of a person holding a strong hand and seeing no reason to pretend otherwise, was that the leverage Harrison Cole typically relied upon did not exist in this case in the way his client had implied it did. Delia had told him, in their initial consultation, that the firm was substantially marital, that the asset base was joint, that Callum's diminished capacity, since the accident would be relevant to questions of competency and decision-making. Every one of these positions had been surgically removed before Harrison Cole made his first call. The firm was structured. The assets were protected. And the suggestion of diminished capacity, beyond being personally offensive, in a way that Petra Holloway had made quietly clear she would address with considerable force if it appeared in any filing, was factually unsupportable given that every restructuring decision had been made with documented legal counsel and witnessed executive board approval. Callum Monroe had not been diminished by his accident. He had been underestimated by his wife. These were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. What happened next did not occur in a courtroom. It occurred, with a particular and almost narrative symmetry, in the kitchen. It was a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the filing, during the period of legal proceedings when both parties still occupied the Whitmore Lane house. an uncomfortable arrangement that Petra Holloway had advised Callum to maintain for strategic reasons she had explained in detail, and he had accepted with characteristic patience. Rosa was in the kitchen when Delia came downstairs. Callum was at the table, the same table where the orange juice had spilled, where the laugh had been aimed, where everything had been witnessed and written down. He was drinking coffee, reading something on his tablet. The morning light came through the window at an angle that caught the gray at his temples and made him look, Rosa thought, not diminished at all, but distilled. Like a man who has been reduced to exactly what is essential and has found that what remains is more than enough. Delia stopped in the doorway. She was in her champagne robe. Her auburn hair was loose. Without the full performance of her public presentation, without the emerald gown and the practiced laugh and the strategic warmth, she looked not less beautiful. Her features didn't change, but smaller somehow, as though the architecture of who she had been performing required the costume to hold its shape. She looked at Callum. He looked up from his tablet. Their eyes met across the kitchen, across the marble floor, across 14 months of Rosa's notebook and 4 years of marriage, and the specific geometry of everything that had been built and dismantled between them. "You planned this," Delia said. Her voice was quiet in a way it rarely was. Not the surgical quiet of her cruelty, a different quiet. The quiet of a person who has run the numbers and arrived at an answer they don't like. "I planned a great many things," Callum said. His voice was even. "It's what I do. The trust, the restructuring, you were already—" She stopped. "I was already protecting what I built," he said. "Yes, because someone needed to." Something crossed her face, not remorse, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a person who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of a miscalculation. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said, and it came out less like an insult and more like an honest admission, which may have been the most honest thing she had said to him in years. "I know," Callum said. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the window. "That," he said quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the light coming through the glass, "was always the problem." Rosa stood at the counter with her hands still and her eyes down, and felt something move through the kitchen that was not triumph, and was not grief, but was something more complicated and more true than either, the particular atmosphere of a long-held breath finally released. Karma does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives the way morning does, without permission, without drama, simply present when you open your eyes. It does not ask whether you are ready. It does not negotiate. It simply is, in the way that consequences always simply are, waiting at the address you yourself provided. Delia Monroe had always believed herself to be a woman who controlled outcomes. She had controlled the narrative of her marriage. She had controlled the social story of Callum's accident, turning it, with practiced subtlety, into a story in which she was the long-suffering, remarkable wife rather than the architect of his daily diminishment. She had controlled the domestic environment of the Whitmore Lane house with a completeness that had gone largely unseen, because the person with the most visibility into it had been, until recently, a quiet woman with dark eyes who kept a notebook in her bag. What she could not control, what no amount of social fluency or practiced performance could redirect, was the conversation that had taken place, quietly and without her knowledge, between Vivienne Holt and 3 members of the city's most significant philanthropic and professional networks. Vivienne was not a gossip. She made this distinction clearly, to herself and others. What she was, at 71, was a woman who understood that silence in the face of observable wrongdoing was itself a choice. And she had lived long enough to be selective about the choices she made. She had said nothing inflammatory. Nothing she could not support with what she had personally witnessed over the course of 30 years of knowing Callum Monroe, and the specific, dateable change in him that had followed his marriage and his accident. She had simply told the truth, in her measured and unimprovable way, to people who were in positions to act on it. The chairwoman of the Monroe Architecture Foundation's board, a woman named Claire Osei who had worked with Callum for 9 years, and who had been watching the post-accident period with a concern she had not known how to articulate, had removed Delia from the Foundation's Honorary Advisory Committee with a letter so diplomatically worded that it communicated its message with complete clarity and zero legal exposure. 2 social invitations that had previously been extended to Delia Monroe, a spring gala and a charity luncheon at which she had expected to continue the devoted wife performance for audiences who had not yet heard any version of the other story, were quietly redirected. The city was not large enough for the silence not to be noticed. And Delia Monroe, who had spent years cultivating a position built on proximity to Callum's name and Callum's firm and Callum's reputation, began to understand slowly. Then all at once, the way all understandings of this weight arrive, that she had spent those years building on borrowed ground. The ground had been called back. She had also, in the 30 days following the filing, lost the Thursday appointments. The person connected to those appointments, a man whose name appears in Petra Halloway's documentation, and who had been, it turned out, far more cautious about his own professional exposure than he had been about Delia's, had ended the arrangement with a text message so brief and so final that even Delia, who had decades of experience calibrating the emotional temperature of men, had read it 3 times before accepting what it said. She was left, in other words, holding exactly what she had built. Which turned out, examined in the clear light of consequence, to be considerably less than she had believed. The house would be sold. The proceeds would be divided. What Delia walked away with was sufficient. She was not destitute, and Callum had not structured any of it with cruelty, which said something about the difference between them that Delia was not yet ready to examine honestly. But it was not the architecture she had been counting on. It was not the firm. It was not the trust. It was not the name in brushed gold letters 3 inches tall on the lobby wall of the Monroe business complex. And it was not. She was beginning to understand in the particular silence of the Whitmore Lane house in its final weeks, the man she had dismissed as broken. He had never been broken. He had been rebuilding. And she had been so certain of his diminishment that she had not noticed. That was the karma. Not a bolt from the sky. Not a dramatic reversal engineered by fate. Just the simple, devastating return of every assumption she had made about him, proven wrong, handed back to her in the form of a reality she had constructed herself. The storm she had never seen coming had already passed, and it had rearranged everything. There is a particular quality to the last morning, in a place that has held both the best and the worst of you. It does not feel like an ending, exactly. It feels more like a clearing, the way a forest floor looks after something has burned through it, raw and open and quietly honest. The false canopy gone, the light reaching the ground for the first time in years. This was the quality of the light on the morning Callum Monroe left the Whitmore Lane house for the last time. He did not look back at the doorway. He had already said goodbye to everything worth keeping. The moving arrangements had been handled with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized the last 4 months of proceedings. Callum was not moving far, an apartment in the east side of the city, ground floor, designed for accessibility with the kind of thoughtfulness that the Whitmore Lane house, for all its expensive square footage, had never truly been adapted to provide. Marcus Webb had helped him find it. Petra Halloway's office had handled the paperwork. It was smaller than the house, considerably smaller. Callum had looked at it the first time on a gray afternoon with Marcus standing beside him, both of them quiet in the way of men who have known each other long enough to understand that some moments don't require words. "It's enough," Callum had said. Marcus had nodded, more than. And it was, because what Callum understood now, what the accident and the marriage and the kitchen mornings and the notebook and the long, quiet months of rebuilding had taught him in the way that only genuine loss teaches, was that enough was not a consolation. Enough was not settling. Enough, arrived at honestly, after everything false had been stripped away, was one of the most precise and valuable things a person could possess. He had spent his life building large. He had believed that scale was synonymous with strength. He understood now that the most important structures were not always the tallest ones. Rosa came on the last morning to help with the final details, not in her official capacity, which had ended when the house sale was finalized, but because she had asked if she could and Callum had said yes in a way that made it clear the question had moved him. She moved through the rooms with her characteristic quietness, packing the last of the kitchen items, organizing the boxes near the front door. The house was largely empty now, the furniture, the art, the expensive accumulations of a life built for display, distributed, divided, departed. What remained in the stripped rooms was the architecture itself, the bones of the house, the windows that Callum had always gravitated toward, the proportions of the entrance hall that he had once pointed out to Rosa on a long-ago afternoon when Delia was out, with the unconscious enthusiasm of a man who cannot look at a well-built thing without wanting to talk about why it works. The ceiling height to floor area ratio, he had said, looking up. Whoever designed this understood something about how space makes people feel. Most people don't notice it consciously, but they feel it. Rosa had looked up too, and tried to understand what he was seeing. She thought about that now, moving through the empty rooms. She thought she understood it better with the house stripped bare, the honest structure visible without the furniture and the performance and the expensive staging that Delia had used to fill every surface. The house was better empty, she thought, truer. She found Callum in the front room, near the window, of course, near the window, looking out at the garden. The morning light was clean and direct. The garden was at the complicated edge of spring, where everything is still deciding whether to come back. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. He said, without turning, "I keep thinking I should feel worse about this." "Do you?" she asked. A pause. Outside, something moved in the garden, a bird, landing briefly on the stone path and then lifting again. "No," he said, and the word came out with a simplicity and a completeness that required nothing added to it. Rosa crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. They looked at the garden together for a moment, the two of them, the man who had built things and the woman who had witnessed things, in the particular companionable silence of people who have been through something real together and no longer need to narrate it. "What will you do?" she asked. "With the firm, with everything." Callum was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she had heard in the study that first afternoon, the aliveness, the current of something moving underneath the surface. "There's a project," he said. "Accessible community housing, 6 sites across the city. I've been developing the design framework for 4 months." A pause. "It turns out there's a great deal you notice about design and accessibility when you're experiencing it from a different angle." Rosa looked at him. He turned from the window and looked at her, and his gray eyes had in them something she had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen only in glimpses, in the study, at the Ardmore, in the brief, unguarded moments between the long performances of endurance. Something unobstructed. Something that had always been there and was now, with the false structure finally cleared away, simply visible. "I have a meeting next Thursday," he said. "With the city planning board, Marcus will be there, and Vivienne, she's agreed to sit on the advisory committee." A small, real smile. She said, and I quote, "About time you built something that actually matters, Callum." Rosa laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that surprises itself. Callum smiled wider, and for a moment, in the stripped and honest light of the empty house, he looked exactly like who he had always been. Delia Monroe moved into a rental apartment on the west side of the city in the 3rd week of May. It was a good apartment. Objectively, materially, by any external measure, it was a good apartment. High ceilings. Good light in the afternoons. A building with a doorman and a lobby that was neither embarrassing nor remarkable. She stood in it on the first evening with a glass of wine and looked around at the walls that were hers now, only hers. No performance required, no audience present, and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling and did not immediately have a name for. It arrived slowly, the way honest feelings often arrive in people who have spent a long time managing them rather than experiencing them. It was not grief, precisely. Grief requires the loss of something that was genuinely yours. What Delia had lost was not a marriage. Marriages are built on foundation, and she had never laid one, but the structure she had built on top of borrowed ground. The position, the social architecture, the reflected name, it was not guilt precisely. Guilt requires a conscience that has been in regular operation, and Delia's had been operating on a reduced schedule for long enough that it could not now generate full power on demand. What it was, she thought, standing in the good light of the late afternoon, was something closer to exposure. The particular feeling of a person who has been seen, really seen, through and through, by someone they had entirely underestimated, and must now build a self that can withstand the seeing. She did not have a name for this process. She would eventually. But that was not tonight's work, and she was not there yet. What she had tonight was the wine and the walls and the quiet, an honest quiet, nothing loaded in it, nothing aimed, and somewhere beneath the exposure and the recalculation, something very small and entirely unfamiliar. The beginning of something that might, over a long time and with genuine effort, become the first true thing she had built. She stood in her good apartment and looked at her walls. The hollow victory she held was not nothing. But it was not what she had reached for, and she knew it. And that knowing, uncomfortable and uninvited as it was perhaps the only thing in the room that belonged entirely and honestly to her. 3 weeks after the Whitmore Lane house was vacated, Rosa Mendez received a phone call from an office she did not immediately recognize. It was from Monroe Architecture and Development's HR director. Callum had submitted a formal referral, detailed, specific, generous in a way that a referral can only be when the person writing it has actually paid attention, recommending Rosa for a coordinator position with the firm's new accessible housing initiative. Community liaison, working directly with residents, families, and the design team to ensure that the people the buildings were being built for were represented in every phase of the process. The salary was considerably more than domestic work. The referral letter, which Rosa read 3 times sitting at her kitchen table, said, in the careful, structurally precise language of a man who means exactly what he writes, that Rosa Mendez had demonstrated exceptional observational intelligence, moral courage under difficult circumstances, and a quality of human attention that most people with professional training never develop. Rosa sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading it. She thought about the notebook. About the first morning in the kitchen with the orange juice and Delia's laugh. About the afternoon in the study when she had placed the notebook on the desk between them, and he had read it in silence, and said thank you with the weight of a man who means far more than his words. She thought about her son, who called on Sundays and was doing well, and her mother, whose medication was not free, and the 22 years of quiet rooms in other people's houses where she had learned to be invisible and had turned that invisibility slowly into a kind of precision. She accepted the position. She started the following Monday. On her first day, she passed through the lobby of the Monroe Business Complex and looked up at the name on the wall, brushed gold letters, 3 inches tall, and thought of the man in the wheelchair at the window, looking out at a garden that was deciding whether to come back. It came back, she thought. Of course it came back. There is a morning that arrives, after the long season of loss, that feels different from the mornings that preceded it. Not because the loss is gone. Loss does not go exactly. It simply finds its proper proportion. But because the person receiving the morning has changed their relationship to it. It is not a morning of triumph. It is quieter and more useful than that. It is a morning of clarity. Callum Monroe woke at 6:30 on a Thursday in October in the apartment that was, 6 months in, no longer new but had become something better, his. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly, structurally his. He made coffee. He had become precise about this in the way he was precise about everything. A specific grind, a specific temperature, a process that was his own and required no accommodation of anyone else's preferences. There was a private pleasure in this that he suspected he would not have understood before the last 2 years. The pleasure of a small, honest thing done well in a space that belonged to you. He took the coffee to the window. There was always a window, and looked out at the east side of the city coming awake in the October light. The building across the street had scaffolding on its upper floors, some kind of renovation in progress. He watched 2 workers move across the scaffolding with the easy, practiced balance of people who have made a temporary structure feel permanent through sheer familiarity. He had a presentation today. The first public unveiling of the Accessible Community Housing Framework. 6 sites, 2 years of development, a design philosophy that had emerged directly from his own experience and Rosa's contribution, and Vivienne Holt's particular ability to ask questions that were really statements in disguise. Marcus would be there. Petra Halloway had sent a note the previous evening, characteristically brief, entirely warm, that simply said you built this one well. Vivienne had called at 9 o'clock the night before and talked for 40 minutes about the politics of city planning boards and the correct way to handle a hostile question from a committee member and the importance of never letting them see you adjust your position under pressure. "Be a building, Callum," she had said. "Know your foundations. Don't sway." He had laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrived without planning. He sat at the window with his coffee and felt the morning for what it was, not the complicated, pressurized mornings of the Whitmore Lane house, loaded with what would happen when Delia came downstairs, calculating the temperature of the room before she entered it. Not the mornings of the hospital, when the ceiling tiles had been the whole world and the future had been a foreign country without a map. This morning, clean and specific and genuinely his. His hands around the coffee cup were steady, steadier than they had been a year ago, because the physical therapy had continued and he had continued with it, and his grip had returned in ways his early prognosis had not promised. Not completely. Perhaps never completely. But enough. More than enough. The project presentation was in 3 hours. He had designed it well. He knew the foundations. He would not sway. He finished his coffee and began to get ready. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The scaffolding workers moving with their practiced ease, the street below filling with the purposeful motion of a morning that belonged to no one and therefore to everyone. The October light was doing something specific to the buildings across the street, catching the upper floors in a gold that lasted only a few minutes before the angle changed. Callum watched it, not with the looking away from things look that Rosa had learned to recognize in the Whitmore Lane kitchen. Not the absence behind the eyes that had been his survival mechanism in the hardest months. With presence. With the particular attentiveness of a man who has paid a significant price to understand the value of a single clear morning and intends to be fully in it. The storm had come. The storm had passed. What it left behind was not the life he had planned. It was something more honest than that. And honesty, he had learned real honesty, the kind that costs something and holds its shape under pressure, was the only foundation worth building on. He was not who he had been before the accident. He was not who he had been inside that marriage. He was, for the first time in longer than he could precisely date, simply and completely himself. And that, it turned out, was more than enough to build from. The Monroe Accessible Housing Initiative broke ground on all 6 sites in the spring of the following year. The event was covered by 3 city publications and 1 national architecture journal, which described the framework as a rare example of design that emerges from lived experience rather than theoretical empathy. Callum gave a short speech at the groundbreaking. He did not speak about the accident or the marriage. He spoke about foundations, about what makes a structure worth building, about the difference between designing for the idea of a person and designing for an actual person in an actual body navigating an actual world. He spoke about the obligation of builders to understand what they are building and for whom. Rosa Mendez stood in the front row in a coat the color of autumn leaves and thought about a notebook in a kitchen and a man at a window and the long, quiet season in which everything real had been decided. Vivienne Holt stood beside her with her amber bead glasses and her ancient, accurate eyes, and clapped with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has lived long enough to see the right outcome arrive and is not remotely surprised by it. Marcus Webb stood to the left of the podium and looked at his oldest friend speaking in the October light and felt the specific, uncomplicated pride of a man who chose correctly a long time ago and has never once regretted it. Delia Monroe was not there. She was in her apartment on the west side of the city, where the light came in well in the afternoons, where she was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, with considerable resistance, the long work of building something that was actually hers. Whether she would finish it was a question only she could answer. Whether she would begin it honestly was the only question that mattered. Karma is not a punishment. It is a mirror. It shows you, with perfect and impersonal accuracy, the precise dimensions of what you built and what you destroyed and what you could not, in the end, take from someone who had decided to keep it. Callum Monroe kept himself. That was the whole story. That was always the whole story. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that being underestimated is not the same as being diminished, that silence can be strength, and that what a person builds in the quiet is often their most enduring work, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Every story we tell here is about the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to survive extraordinary circumstances with their dignity not just intact, but deepened. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. We'll see you in the next one.